All right, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, whenever you're watching this. Today is the start of today's Monday, February 13th, and it's the start of week 6 of the semester. I'm going to quickly talk about sort of the agenda for the week and then go into the content of this slide presentation, which is about research and theory, mostly about theory, and why do we care about theory when we're studying public relations. So, let's see, get my cursor on the right screen here. So, the chapter for this week is Practicing Public Relations, and this slide deck has information about theory and a little bit about academic research at the end. And then there's a second slide deck that is about writing and public relations and why writing is important and some of those types of things. There will be a PDF reading that goes along with that. That's supplemental. It's required, but it is supplemental. So it'll be listed also in the course outline, and I'll make sure to link it to the modules page for this week so you can see that. But this slide presentation is about theory, and essentially a lot of times the first question I get is, why do I care about theory? I know that in some classes that you take, especially if they're ACE classes and they talk about theory, it can be fairly dull, kind of stodgy. But one great thing about communication theory as it relates to public relations is that it really can help us better understand our audiences and therefore better plan for what do they need. So it helps us understand what are the psychological needs and desires of our audiences. So some of these theories are very focused on or very well connected to psychology. So if you see some of these theories in other classes, especially psychology-related classes, don't be surprised. So effectively, these help us create the best, most targeted messages and campaigns possible. We can address both active audiences, people who are fully engaged with our particular organization, but it also can meet some of the information needs of people who are a little bit more passive or not so in tune with our organization. And it really also helps us identify multiple different communication strategies and methods. So that's one of the main reasons we talk about theory. They can also help us ensure that when doing our work, we are building towards the positive reputation of our company, or our organization. So there are two types of theories that are considered useful in public relations. The first one is mass communication, and that's mostly a function of the history of what's called the news or the press or those types of terms. But also theories of interpersonal communication can be helpful. We're mostly going to focus on mass communication theories as we discuss things today. And again, Chapter 4 in Smith does introduce these theories and talk about some of the basic elements of them. So, I am a big fan of the Big Bang Theory, so anytime there's an opportunity for a slide where I can show the Big Bang Theory, I am a big fan of it. It doesn't exactly directly connect to our discussion of theory, but I do try and insert Big Bang Theory slides wherever possible. So in thinking about what are some of the goals of mass communication theory, there's really two things. One is explaining what happens to people and their minds and the way they think about things when they experience mass communication, when they consume mass media. The second type of goal, or the second goal, is explaining how people use different mass communication media. And so there's two kinds of things when you're thinking about how people use mass media that you might consider. There's this idea of cognitive psychology, how people think, and then how they process information. So cognitive psychology is about how people think, and then information processing is about how people understand messages. So there's two sort of components to how people use mass communication. But it also can help us explain how people learn from mass media. A lot of times when you're working for a nonprofit or intergovernmental organization, you want to give people information and you want to educate them on a particular topic. And so knowing how people learn information from different media is really, really important. And then it also helps us understand how are people's views, how are their values affected and shaped by mass media. So some really important elements to thinking about communication theory. So in your book, Smith talks about media effects theories, and he says that there are three types of communication theories. The way that I look at them and I've studied them, there really are two types. There's first this idea of direct effects, and then the idea of limited and or moderated effects. So I'll show you a little bit of a diagram here. So direct effects theories, and we're going to talk about some of them specifically, those primarily came out of communication study in the 1940s and the 1950s. And they had a different set of assumptions than the newer limited and moderated effects theories that are pretty present day. I think we'll talk about the diffusion of innovations on this slide and hierarchy of needs. We won't talk about social learning theory. But the idea is that there has been a change in communication theory study, the field of study, starting out in the 40s and 50s with this idea of direct effects and moving to more limited effects or moderated effects today, that we understand that there is a difference. So in talking a little bit about some of the early direct effects theories, the first one that's most commonly known is the magic bullet theory. It's also called the hypodermic needle theory. I choose to not depict hypodermic needle theory, but the idea here is that the mass media have a direct impact on people's perceptions, on people's attitudes, behaviors, those types of things. And so a little diagram here at the bottom from the mass media to the public, there was an assumption that it was very, very powerful messages, and this is where propaganda posters like the ones that you see in this slide here came into play during World War I and World War II. Propaganda was a big part. If you've ever studied any of the history of that time, propaganda posters were a big deal. But the assumption was that you saw these messages and that you then adopted the attitude or adopted the perspective of that particular message. You didn't necessarily take into account as a researcher at this time that there may be other factors other than this mass media message that went into people's, for example, support of World War I, World War II. And so things like what your family thought, whether or not you had a family who was a military member and fighting in the war, or what your friends or opinion leaders, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, it didn't account for anything other than you seeing the message and adopting the perspective. Okay? So the idea was there was one magic bullet, and you adopted that particular, and that the idea of the hypodermic needle theory was that it was directly injected into your perspective. Then we moved to a little bit more of a complex idea, sort of the next step from the magic bullet theory. And that was the idea of the two-step flow model of communication. And what happens here, as you can see, there's another step, right? This addition of opinion leaders. And the idea behind the two-step flow theory is that mass media create messages, and then opinion leaders filter that message out to the public. And so you can see here on this slide several very prominent mass media people, all broadcast faces here. And this old guy in the black and white photo is Walter Cronkite, just so you know who he is. Some of these others you probably know and are familiar with. There is also discussion in this idea of two-step flow that newscasters kind of started to play a role in opinion leadership as well, because you see the same face night after night used to be that people got a lot of their news from broadcasts, and that's still the case, but less and less so. So the face in the nightly news, such as Walter Cronkite, was very, very important, and that sort of also was considered in some respects opinion leadership. But specifically talking about opinion leaders and who they are, these are people who act as what are seen as intermediaries. And between mass media, so you saw that little chart on the last slide, and they're sort of the filter or the mediator through which these mass media messages pass. And so these people have the ability to influence influence the public's perspective on things. And so these can be anybody. These can be people who are city council, school board, people who are leaders in civic organizations, especially things like those that are encourage people to register to vote, that type of thing. Why are these people opinion leaders? They essentially personify the value of civic life. So they believe that voting is important, and so therefore, if they speak about something that is related to voting specifically, you're more likely to listen to them. So opinion leaders are opinion leaders because of what they know, the information they know, and who they know. Another great example of opinion leadership is somebody who's the head of a religious organization. You'll see an example on the next slide about that. So these are people who, opinion leaders are not only these people who often have formal leadership positions, but they are also people who are very, very informed. They watch the news, they read, they listen to the news, and then they share what they have interpreted from that mass media to the public. And so that's how those two steps of the two-step flow works. There's also this idea of the N-step theory, and that is different in that opinion leadership differs based on what the particular topic is. So a first example here is a photograph of Ben Sasse, who's one of the U.S. senators from the state of Nebraska. So Ben Sasse, Senator Sasse, can be considered an opinion leader on the things that are happening in Nebraska that relate specifically to the federal government, because that's his role. He's a U.S. senator, and he works with the federal government in the legislative branch. But opinion leadership is different, according to different topics. And so different people are credible about different things. So, for example, Senator Sasse might not be he might not be an opinion leadership when it comes to morality issues or things like that. That might be somebody who is more in the line of a religious leader. So other examples of opinion leaders. This is obviously Governor Ricketts, and so he's an opinion leader with respect to the state of Nebraska and what's happening at the state level. Matters of finance and economy. This is a picture of Janet Yellen, who is the chairwoman of the Federal Reserve, and most importantly, they set interest rates. So if you have a credit card or a car loan or any kind of loan, and you pay a percentage of interest on it, the Federal Reserve is in charge of that rate. And so she is very knowledgeable. She's an opinion leader on finance and the economy here in the United States. Other examples are, this is a picture of former Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack. We don't currently have a Secretary of Agriculture because we're waiting for confirmation from the new cabinet. But again, the Pope is a great example of an opinion leader, not only on issues of morality and religious belief, but today this Pope, Pope Francis, is also seen as a leader, an opinion leader on social justice issues and things related to science like climate change. So opinion leadership differs based on the particular topic, and that's this idea of the N-step theory versus the two-step flow theory, where opinion leaders, it doesn't matter the topic. Okay. So if you think about our UNL community, who are our opinion leaders? well President Bounds, who's in charge of the University of Nebraska system, our Chancellor Ronnie Green. We have a new Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Academic Officer, Gandhi Plowman. And so those are people whose opinions guide us as a University of Nebraska, Lincoln especially, community. Dean Waller as well, definitely an opinion leader. Also, another example of an opinion leader that is technically outside of the university system, but very important to our UNL community, is Senator Adam Moorfeld, and he's the legislator from District 46 in the Nebraska legislature. And he is, his district, 46, is downtown Lincoln and the University of Nebraska area. So he is an important opinion leader with respect to what goes on in the Nebraska legislature regarding that part of Lincoln and the state. The other thing here, I think I have his picture linked to an organization that he actually started, is Nebraskans for Civic Reform. And as an example of an organization that is led by opinion leaders on issues related to voting rights in the state of Nebraska, that might be an organization to look into if you're looking for examples of opinion leadership and what does that look like. Moving on to another issue, or excuse me, another theory is this idea of agenda setting theory. And agenda setting theory says essentially that there is a relationship between what's covered in the news, in mass media, and what people think is important to discuss in society. So this comes from a 1972 study that was done related to, I think it was a presidential election. And basically these researchers, McCombs and Shaw, saw that there was indeed a correlation between what showed up in newspapers, so they examined what was in the newspapers, and then what people reported as important issues of the day. And so what's really important to understand related to this is that mass media have an effect on what issues people consider important to discuss. Now, something important to understand about this particular theory is that it's great. There's a great quote. It says, this theory may not be successful much of the time in telling people exactly what to think, but it is stunningly successful in telling people what to think about. So, instead, as an example, this is a shot of the front page of the New York Times today. There is, one of these first articles is about the president's sons and running his business now that he has stepped down. It doesn't tell you what you should think about this topic, but by virtue of the fact it's on the front page and it has a significant amount, it's what you consider above the fold. If this is a typical newspaper and it's folded in half at the newsstand, which I know you don't generally see anymore, but if you see a printed copy of this newspaper, chances are it's folded in half, and so above the fold you see this particular story. You also see a story about the National Security Council, and then down towards the bottom you can see there was the Grammys were on last night, and the president of Japan is here in the United States. So by virtue of the fact that these things are covered on the front page of the New York Times, they're important. Now, this coverage doesn't say what you should think about them, but it says that these are important things about what's going on right now. And so the agenda setting hypothesis is that the media, by virtue of the fact that they cover certain things, are saying to the public, this is what you should consider important to discuss. A couple more theories to be aware of, this idea of diffusion or diffusion of innovations. And Smith talks about it a little bit in chapter 4, but the idea that people receive information and adopt information at different rates or adopt new technologies. So here you can see this idea of if you're talking about an innovation, so say like the new iPhone, back when the iPhone was brand new, somebody who was first in line at the Apple Store to purchase the iPhone when it was brand new would be somebody who'd be considered an innovator. And then somebody who maybe still doesn't have an iPhone today, or maybe today has, now that we're on iPhone version 7, maybe has iPhone version 4 or something like that. But they adopt things, innovations, or process information at different rates. Another one is this idea of cognitive dissonance theory. We seek information that decreases dissonance. So we are interested in information that doesn't make our brains work extra hard, that doesn't disagree with information that we already have. So this example of a stop sign is really great. What's the problem with it? Well, stop signs are not green, right? Stop is associated with the color red. And so this is an example of great cognitive dissonance where you see the stop sign, the shape, and the letters that you normally see, but it's different. There's dissonance here because of the green color. That's not the color that normally is associated with stop, and that's not what a typical stop sign looks like. So it kind of makes you stop for a second and go, whoa, what's wrong with that? Here's another example of cognitive dissonance. This idea is a political cartoon from a few years ago, but that people don't want this idea of socialized medicine, and yet Medicare, which is a kind of the idea is a little bit socialized medicine, that people don't want something of President Obama's, but they do want this idea of socialized medicine. And so what he was proposing, I think this was back during the Affordable Care Act debate. So there's two ideas, people thinking that those are mutually exclusive. There's another theory, I believe it's also talked about in your chapter 4, which is a great one, and it's this idea of uses and gratifications. We believe, or we actively seek out a particular type of media to satisfy a need. So the perfect example for me that I think of is seeking sort of pleasure and things like that. So I watch The Walking Dead, and I also follow the Twitter feed related to that while I'm watching. So I actively seek out Twitter and social media while I'm watching television, while I'm watching The Walking Dead. And so there are different things that we seek out from different media. We use certain media to gratify certain desires. So need for information. I'm interested in staying up to date with what's going on in the world. So I'll follow a particular news outlet or something like that. So uses and gratifications just says we actively seek out a particular type of media to satisfy a particular type of need. Framing theory is a personal favorite of mine. It's what I used part of for my dissertation, but framing is essentially the idea that we frame an argument in a certain way using certain images or sources or lack of certain images or sources of information. And we emphasize certain aspects of things. So a great visual example of framing is this, and pardon the ornate, kind of cheesy frame of this photo here. But what you see in this photo is two guys in a field, right? But this photograph, in actuality, had more in it than you see here, and it's framed in such a way to just include these two individuals. As you can see here, there's a whole line of students taking photos. This is from a study abroad to England and Scotland that we did a couple years ago, that we're hoping to do again this summer. And so by framing only the two men in the photo, we framed out this whole part of the story, which is this group of people photographing these two guys and the fact that this is part of a study abroad. So a more accurate framing is this photo with the frame on it. But that if you take this visual and sort of think about how a news story is written or how a feature story is written, certain things are emphasized over other things to kind of focus the reader or the public's mind on a certain type of message. Priming theory is this idea that we make judgments about things that are really complicated based on things that we already know. And part of this is the idea that our minds, we're what's called cognitive satisficers, and as human beings, our minds automatically look for the easiest explanation or the easiest way to process information or to think about things so that we can conserve energy for the other things that we have to do. So priming is this idea of we make connections when we see something that's related to something we already know, we make a connection there. We might not hear the whole message because we've made that connection already. Maslow's hierarchy of needs isn't discussed in the Smith chapter, but one of the important reasons that I include it here is because of, and you might have heard of Maslow's hierarchy. This is something that we talk a lot about in the field of agriculture. But the idea here is that if people don't have their physiological and some of these more basic needs satisfied, they're not really able to hear messages or think about things that are all the way up here: leadership, success, that type of thing. So if you're a homeless kid and you don't have enough food to eat, it's not very likely that you're going to be able to easily reach this leadership and prestige area of the top of the pyramid here. So why do we think about theory? Well, essentially it helps us think about how we could potentially explain how people might think about or behave. And the reason is we want to be able to make some predictions, not always 100% accurate, right? But we want to make some predictions about how people will react to a certain message or a certain type of campaign, something like that. So again, the goals of communication theory are to explain how mass communication affects people, how people use mass media, what we can learn from this, and then how media is involved in shaping people's perceptions, their views, things like that. So as you think about your organization and we go into the next few steps of creating pieces of communication, communication tools on behalf of your organization, think about the role that theory might play in how you look at your organization and how you consider your organization's public audiences.